that's why it's always ironic to me when people come to me and they want me to do more gender in hip-hop scholarship. It's just because they don't know that there's so many women at so many different levels, so many different institutions who have already really articulated very, very sophisticated engagements with this. But it's extremely frustrating. So I wonder, my question for you is, what can we do? And that's not even to mention the kind of work that people like Mark Anthony Neal and other like black male feminists do. I'm just talking about the women who address these issues. And the fact that even outside of issues of gender, women predominate within hip-hop scholarship. I'm not saying that as a critique, I'm saying that as a fact of the reality of the scholarship. In fact, not for someone like Imani Perry or like Trisha Rose, I couldn't even be here as a scholar. My scholarship is rests on their scholarship. So I wonder if you could share with me, how do we address that? How do we change that? What can be done to change that perception? Again, I share your frustration. I just wonder what we've done. And I'm also, and one other question for you too, I'm also unclear within your paper as to whether or not you agree with MK's presupposition in there. And so I don't know if you can answer that really, like, do you agree with what he's saying or the push that he's making to move beyond hip-hop culture? I think it's a little premature, but I wonder what you think about those things. Sin, obviously, I think that paper is fantastic. I want to push you more to be more critical of me there, because I think what you're saying is a very important corollary and a very, very important new development based on that essay that I wrote a couple of years back. I mean, I think if your critique or your addition to it is right on point in the sense that things have changed. And you can't really talk about dead presidential representation the way I'm trying to talk about it in the Obama era. So I like all the things that you're adding on there. I wonder, though, if in the longer version of this, if you give us or wrestle more with a more in-depth definition of social optimism, right? Because it's an important term. I'm glad you're framing that within this discourse. I think a lot of people want to try to talk about all these rappers talking about Obama, and I think social optimism is a good way of framing that. But I think ultimately you're going to have to consider artists that are not mainstream that are engaging in that same discourse. Not to glorify the underground, but just, I think, to get the full catalog of everyone who's engaging around that. And I wonder, maybe the question for you is where you see social optimism operating in that underground sort of music. So I don't think we normally think of underground hip-hop as being socially optimistic, but I wonder if you can just connect those two. And Wilfredo, you know, I love this paper. I've heard the version of this paper, so I'm very committed to it, but there's always a couple challenges with Lessig, right? I mean, Lessig's work is very powerful, but he's not thinking about hip-hop as consciously as you probably want him to be, right? And so this concept of listen, write is very, very important. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about exactly how that functions within Lessig's framework. I'm not sure if it was clear in the summary you gave of your paper. It's clearer in the paper. I think you should share with us a little bit more about exactly what listen, write culture is and what it means, and specify its relationship to read, write, and read-only culture. I mean, what Lessig is talking about is a paradigmatic shift in how we interact with text, period, right? And obviously, the listen, write piece it shows one of his blind spots in that work. So I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about how LW relates with RO and RW.
Well, I guess to respond to the first question, yeah, I wouldn't be here either. Dr. Perry was on my dissertation committee, so literally. And I think the challenge is that sometimes when we look at the canon, whatever that might be to us, is often from a male perspective. And so one of the things that I did, and this is from Pearl Clee, who taught at Spelman for a number of years, she said, you know, think about how you teach using only women writers. And so that question to a lot of people is sort of, okay, now, if I want to talk about this period, how do I do that without my go-to guys? So in terms of what we do, I think just in terms of our praxis, not so much what we say, but what we live, what we do, that's a place for revision. And I think that so much of how we see, how our lens, our framing of questions and how we approach is gendered in ways that we don't fully understand and therefore can't really articulate. So part of that journey for me has been to look at particularly Butler's work and looking at second and third wave feminist movements and trying to read across those particular texts and to make sense of what my responsibility is in that. And also, I've looked at some of the literature by white writers in the anti-racist movement. Tim Wise, Peggy McIntosh. And I think there's something to be learned there in terms of dominant politics. One of the things that they are constantly returning to in their work is not a position of harm to others, but over advantage in my context. And so I've kind of looked at that in terms of the way gender plays out, at least the way that we understand gender. How that dominant identity and sort of deconstructing that is a process, a critical process in dealing with, you know, the frustration with hip-hop literature. In terms of Asante Jr., I disagree with him. We had a conversation before. He was actually writing his book that's out now, and I completely disagree. I think it's ironic that his book opens with the same quote from Fanon that Katwana's book opens with. So you're calling for the end of hip-hop, but you're constantly borrowing from hip-hop, which to me is, again, like you're saying, it's a bit premature, and I don't know if there's been a full investigation of the way in which progressive elements of hip-hop exist. And sort of what I'm getting to in the paper, the part that I didn't fully articulate, is that the progressive element is there. And there are a number of organizations, and not surprisingly, a large number of them are headed by women. Not just in the U.S., but internationally. And how right now we're all, you know, scholars, I mean, it's important that we write, but while many of us are writing, they're doing the work, and it's happening. And really quick example, Invincible, MC out of the Detroit area, who turned down a recording contract to have our own cooperative, more democratic-based distribution system. Probably not as financially well off as, you know, Jay-Z, but she's someone who's in control of her image. She's someone who's in control of the kind of things that she talks about. And she's in control of how she represents her agency as a woman, which, as we know in more commercial spaces, that's often policed and dictated. So it's not a surprise that only one or two females exist at a time. Although anybody who is a fan of the culture would know that that's not the case. If you go outside of what, you know, television is telling you or radio is telling you. So I think you know, that's a continual source of frustration. But I think, you know, it's one of those things like Powell talks about in his, you know, little book, who's going to take the weight. I don't know that many of us, I'm talking about men, have really interrogated sexism, other than what we see a lot of times with these rap panels where we acknowledge that it exists and is often bad, but life is sexist, so what are you going to do? That sort of is like the end of the conversation. So I find that problematic because, you know, that's not an effective way to deal with some of the issues and concerns.
To address your question, I think it's kind of ironic that social optimism is not an American concept, especially in this point in time with the recession, with what's going on. So I actually didn't get to it in my paper because I had to cut it short, but basically I did get information about how optimism and pessimism are actually socially contagious, that it can be easily spread to other individuals, and this is coming from a report from Britain, and them analyzing internationally, like, about what this concept means. And a lot of people are going around saying, oh yeah, there's all these rappers talking about Obama, and it's like, okay, so what are you trying to say? So that social optimism is that connection that they are experiencing this hope and this inspiration for change that wasn't necessarily there before in, you know, in the critique that hip-hop had of government and politics. So it is ironic that I am talking about optimism, social optimism, in a time like this, where people could be talking about so many other negative, pessimistic things, but that is what President Obama is offering the hip-hop generation. And that's the only connection that you can make, is that they do feel this hope, they do feel this slogan, they do feel, you know, like, yes, we can, and that's the connection. In terms of, like, relating this a little bit more to artists that are not mainstream,